the first three lectures I forgot uh, to record in the beginning, and there are a couple minutes
Okay.
lost.
Hmm. Oh, there we go.
Lots of echo. I wonder what that is.
All right. I'm just seeing. Oh,
Yeah,
there's
it's not for us. It's not for me, and I think the others
I don't hear anything, I don't think.
maybe.
Yeah, I don't hear anything. I see an aqua blue person lurking in the background, Brooke.
Yep, that's
So
my dad. I'm in his office.
yeah, that my house was just musical offices to this morning, which is why
Yeah,
I was like, I'm going to campus.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm in New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Well, if anyone wants to maybe log out and log in again, sometimes that helps with
With the
problems.
sound, yeah.
So I don't know.
Is anybody else on the call hearing an echo? Because I don't hear one either, Brooke.
Yeah. See in the chat.
No, I'm okay.
No, okay. Okay,
Okay,
so yeah.
Salem is fine.
Okay. All right. Looks
Okay,
like
so might be something on Judith's end. So
yeah.
maybe
Okay.
she goes out and come in again.
Judith, do you have two devices going simultaneously? That's
That
often where
might,
I
yeah.
get the echo.
Somebody doesn't hear anything. Okay,
Hmm.
I don't know.
Hmm. No. Just make sure device volume is up. Okay, iPhone off. Yeah, that probably did it.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So good. Okay, good. Just no echo. That's more reassuring. But thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we solved the problem.
Good, good, good.
Yeah. We have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Hmm.
No.
What's wrong?
Judith is saying she still has the echo. I don't know what it could be.
Do you want me to log out and log back in?
I
No, no,
I
no.
think it's probably on her end
That
because
must be on
others
her
aren't
end.
don't
Yeah.
seem to be having the same problem.
Okay.
But I thought the iPhone would solve it.
Yeah. Try the log out and log in. That sometimes, for mysterious reasons, solves problems.
Yeah. It's like rebooting a laptop.
Right, exactly. When all else fails, just shut it down.
So, Marcel, are you in your office?
I am in my office,
Okay. I was
which is
wondering.
already like half empty because I'm moving offices
Oh, where are you moving to?
to my old office and
Back
the
to
other side of
me.
the building. Yeah, so,
Oh, wow.
which has unfortunately less bookshelves.
Oh, that would be a huge problem for me.
Yeah,
I know I have mine double deep.
yeah, I
So
hate that. Yeah, but
Yeah,
will do what I have to do.
I might have to do some of that and vertical stacking.
yeah.
Okay, so let me get this started. So I am pleased to introduce our presenter today, Professor Krystyn Moon from the Department of History and American Studies. She is teaching in both, and she is a trained historian, does a lot of work in American studies here at the university and also in the community. Her introductory course to American Studies is also one of our key courses for our new a food studies minor in whose creation she was instrumental to set up the curriculum and to get it approved. And we start that in the fall. You might have seen the advertisement slides that I included in our slide deck at the beginning. So Professor Moon is quite a foodie. She cooks and she eats
I
uh,
eat a lot.
interesting and interesting interesting things. And she will talk to us today about global cuisines in motion.
So thank you, Professor Rauter, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining me this sort of hot and balmy afternoon. I'm coming in from Fredericksburg, and I'm in my office right now, which actually has some great AC. Before we get started, I do want to talk a little bit more about what I do. So as Professor Rauter mentioned, I teach the American Foodways class in the American Studies program. This is actually our methods class for our newly established food studies minor. It is one of our most diverse minors. It's supposed to complement all the different programs we offer, everything from business to environmental science and biology, to anthropology, sociology, and of course, American studies and everything in between. But in addition to that, I've done research in Cuba. And in fact, I had a wonderful time going with some alums to Cuba, and I hope to do it again. My work in Cuba was a collaboration with Cuban scholars on food traditions in central Cuba and Santa Spiritus. And some of that work informs what I'll be talking about today. All right, so that's sort of a little bit about me. Let's get things started. Hold on, sorry. This is actually a video, but you can hear the ambient noise. So if you notice, by the way, most of the photos, these are things that I've actually eaten or I've cooked throughout. There's a couple places where obviously that will not be the case, but again, just sort of showing sort of the food, the culinary cosmopolitanism that I'll be talking about, but also, thinking through it as part of my own lived experience. In terms of our roadmap for today, I'm going to start talking actually about the concept of food exchange and the ways in which that has emerged over time. And then we're going to fast forward to the contemporary period and talk about food in relationship to globalization. We'll work through the three major themes: the economics, the politics, and the social and cultural aspects of it. We will then move to some of the reactions to food and globalization that has sort of expanded, particularly in the 21st century. We see it across the political spectrum in a lot of really interesting ways. And then finally, I'm going to end with talking about, and this is mostly for the students, to think about their relationship with food on a global level and what they should maybe start thinking about and questioning as well. All right, so that's sort of an intro. Let's get started talking about food and food exchange or food on the move. First and foremost, food on the move is central to our humanity. Sort of drop mic, walk away. It is part of our earliest histories from archaeology to our present. We know, for example, early humans had to follow food in order to survive, whether we're talking about animals or we're talking about plants, seeds, fruits, etc. And even when we start to see early settlement, that is often driven by food, whether we're talking about domestication of animals or the ability to manipulate plants to grow them in a location again and again, particularly things like wheat, for example. In addition, with that early settlement, of course, emerges the idea of exchange, meeting other people and sharing and swapping things maybe that we don't have or maybe that they do differently. And with these exchanges, we often create meaning. That meaning facilitates symbolism, that food means particular things, whether we're talking about holidays in our present sense or maybe just connections with other people. So, what about today? Well, none of that's actually gone away. All of that persists with the 21st century. But there are some things that are unique to our historical moment. First and foremost is the innovations related to transportation. We can move food across the world within a day. That's why, for example, for our students, you are able to read about tuna being caught in Maine, being sent to Japan, all happening within 24 hours. We also consume food through information, thanks to new forms of digital media, whether we're talking about YouTube or even celebrity chef shows, these dare shows, all sorts of things. We get food information that way. But at the same time, with all this great technology that allows us to be connected to more information, to more food, there's also a level of detachment from where food is from, the meaning that it's often had for the people who produce it, and that creates a level of alienation. That's also something that we have to grapple with, particularly in places like the United States. So again, there's a lot of sort of pros and cons, and you have to sort of figure out where you sit in all of this. I want to provide a couple of examples from history, and then we're going to move to the present day. One of my favorite things to teach is actually this cookbook, The Form of Curry. The Form of Curry was written around 1390 under the reign of King Richard II. We don't know who the author is, but we suspect that it was a collaboration between scribes within the court and cooks. Cooks knew how to cook. They didn't know usually how to write. Scribes probably didn't know how to cook, but they knew how to write. So that's why we presume they worked together. This collection is foundational also in terms of thinking about American cuisine. Many of the recipes that we even see in our cookbooks today, we can find the roots of it in this particular cookbook, The Form of Curry. One of those recipes is right in front of you. We call it blancmange. Um, I know it's kind of hard reading the Middle English, but I'm going to give you a couple hints to help you out. So this is actually the precursor to the modern pudding, particularly rice pudding. Today, when you Google blancmange, you will find something that is very sweet. That doesn't really emerge until the 18th and 19th century. This is a much more savory dish. This involves capons, which are chickens, being boiled to create a chicken broth. That meat is then taken out, and you add blanched almonds that have been ground, mixed with milk, rice, white grease, basically grease, sugar, and salt and anise. You then add the meat back in, you shred it, and that is what blancmange is. It's almost like a chicken and rice stew, but it becomes incredibly glutinous. So hopefully you can sort of imagine what it is like. But the reason why I want to talk about it for our purposes today is there are three ingredients here that really jump out at me. It's the almonds, the rice, and the sugar. Those three things do not grow in England. They had to get them from somewhere, most likely Spain, if not from somewhere in the Mediterranean, where, of course, almonds, rice, and sugar can be grown. Now, you might also wonder, say, well, is this then a dish for an elite household? Probably not, because we have evidence that people of the middling classes also consume blancmange, hence the quote at the bottom from Geoffrey Chaucer. This is from the prologue for the cook in the Canterbury Tales, which is written only 15 years after the Form of Curry, when he mentions that the cook is known for his blancmange, although his character is otherwise quite suspect. The fact that the cook in Canterbury Tales is making blancmange speaks to other sort of middling classes being able to consume something that perhaps we would presume would be more elite. But we do know that a lot of these spices and items such as rice are being consumed by everyday people too. Now, this is from the 14th century. I'm going to move us forward into the 19th and 20th century and talk about one of my favorite fruits, the tomato. If you haven't checked it out, there's this wonderful book by an author named Annie Gall called Nile Nightshade, and that's what I'll be talking about today. She actually teaches in the Arabic program up at the University of Maryland, College Park. Annie Gall, in her work, talks about how ubiquitous tomatoes are in terms of Egyptian cuisine today, that literally tomatoes are eaten morning, noon, and night. And she wanted to know Why or how did that happen? You can see in the infographic here, Egypt is the #1 producer of tomatoes in Africa. I will also tell you it's the 5th largest producer of tomatoes in the world. They actually produce more tomatoes than Italy and the United States, which is absolutely amazing. Again, blew my sort of presumptions about tomatoes and who eats them and who produces them. So why and how did this come to be? Well, it just so happens that in Egypt, in the 18th century and earlier, they ate something that they called uta. Uta is actually an African eggplant. Now, both eggplants and tomatoes are in the nightshade family. And if you Google African eggplant, you will notice it looks a lot like a tomato. And so early on, Egyptians called tomatoes uta because of that similarity and quickly started to incorporate it into their cuisine. So much so that by the 19th century and early 20th century, we start to see loan words emerging in Egyptian Arabic, such as tomatin, which obviously is coming from the word tomato, as well as salsa, which is the Spanish word for sauce, being part of the vernacular as well. But what else is at work here is agricultural innovation, and that's tied to colonization, especially from the British. And that's also an important thing in terms of foregrounding our understanding of globalization. With the British in Egypt, we see all sorts of changes in the way in which agriculture operates. First and foremost is the introduction of various forms of mechanized equipment, most notably the tractor. Second are chemically based fertilizers and pesticides. Now, note I say chemically based because before we know that people had fertilizers and pesticides. They were just made differently. So it's not like they're completely new. There's just different ways to do it. But the real game changer when it comes to Egypt and agriculture is irrigation, and especially the damming of the Nile and the Aswan Dam. With the Aswan Dam, which was purposely built to help facilitate cotton cultivation, not tomatoes, but it had ramifications for agriculture writ large. That allowed the production of tomatoes all year round. It's something that's actually quite exceptional and why tomatoes can be consumed the way it is in a place like Egypt. As a result, by the late 19th and early 20th century, we start to see processing plants that are making that salsa that I just mentioned before. And in fact, by the early part of the 20th century, we have American companies like Heinz coming in and participating in tomato production or processing. And then finally in our cookbooks, particularly for soups and stews. Now, remember, tomatoes are a New World food, but they are absolutely central to what we call Egyptian food today, which is again, sort of speaking to how food is on the move. Now, what I'd like to do is sort of stop my screen share for a little bit, and I'd love for folks to put some stuff in the chat that maybe are food items that you have enjoyed or experienced that might be relevant to these types of food exchanges, whether it's a recipe or maybe a new world food that came to another part of the world, etc. See if we can see what people are posting in the chat. Or maybe not. That's okay too. I can keep on presenting. That's fine. So that's a-okay. So let's move to globalization and food today. So globalization and food today. Oh, I saw something in the chat. Let's see if I can see it.
Says we use a lot. Can you see it?
Yeah, peach
Okay.
cobbler, excellent. A lot of Mexican and Asian recipes in your family. Absolutely. Nice. Yeah, peach cobbler. What's fascinating about peach cobbler is many of the spices, of course, are coming in from Southeast Asia. Peaches would have been brought, if you're eating it, here in the United States, peaches are not native to North America. They would have been brought from the US. as well as sugar, right? I just talked about sugar too. Gumbo's a great one too, right? What a fabulous fusion food. We're talking about things like sausage and okra, delicious, one of my favorite things. Again, speaking to West African food traditions, mixing with French and Spanish, some indigenous too. So very cool. And then, Hannah, do you have a specific one for Mexican or Asian recipes that you remember? And then while she's thinking, I see American spaghetti. Does that involve spaghetti and meatballs? Is that what you're thinking of? For my Italian side of my family, that's the meatballs are always a very American thing. So, and in fact, meatballs were invented in the United States, which is kind of wild. Um, so just something to think about. Stir fry, dumplings, ramen. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All yummy things. Very, yeah. And
There's some in
ramen.
the Q&A box too. It's called one posted avocados and lutefisk.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Professor Router. I can only see so much.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I was going to talk a little bit about ramen because we associate that with Japan, but actually it was Chinese vendors that introduced these sort of quick noodles in streetcar, like on street corners in the early part of the 20th century. So this is definitely like one of these food exchanges that becomes synonymous with a cuisine, much like when I was talking about tomatoes in Egypt. Um, he combined his favorite German veggies with tomato sauce along with meatballs. Excellent. Cool. Was there carrots? Because I've seen people do carrots in tomato sauce, which I did not know was a thing as well. So cool. Yeah, so we already sort of know some of this stuff, right? It's part of our lived experience. It is definitely part of my lived experience too. As you can see, I like to eat lots of different things. Here you actually see some of those things. This on the left is a birthday cake that I ate in Seoul, South Korea. It is made entirely of ice cream, believe it or not. And I will also say it was amazing and delicious. Ice cream, of course, is not something that is originally from South Korea. It was most likely introduced by Europeans or Americans. The next image is bok choy that I grew in my backyard. I was very excited. I didn't kill it because oftentimes in the spring when we're heading into finals, I'm not really diligent in my garden. The next item is actually called a spice bag. This is something that's very popular in Ireland, particularly at Chinese restaurants. It's a mixture of fried chicken, sort of Chinese, sort of five spice and chilies and stuff like that, and potatoes. And then the last thing was a matcha milk tea with boba that I had in Springfield, Illinois, a place where I didn't expect to have boba. But I did. And again, sort of all these different things, food on the move in lots of different ways across the world. This is definitely part of my lived experience, but there are also some things that I have to sort of think about in terms of all the food that I enjoy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those in just a second. So there we go. So first, we have to talk a little bit about the economics of food and globalization, and particularly as it relates to late capitalism. I mentioned earlier some of the agricultural innovations that were at work, particularly in places like Egypt as the result of the British. We see that happening not just in Egypt, but throughout the world in the 19th and 20th century. And again, it's tied to equipment, fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation. Those are the four big ones. You also can point to things like the seeds themselves as well. We also see corporations consolidating so that they literally control everything from farm to fork. And as a result, that allows them to have incredible control over their product. The last component of the economics that I want to point out is the emergence of or embracement of Fordism. Fordism is a term that we use to describe some of the efficiencies created by Henry Ford on the assembly lines in Detroit building cars. It is really about the way in which you can break up work into small segments so that persons or people on the assembly lines just do the same thing over and over again, but it allows you to speed up how fast that item is made. Those three things are incredibly important in terms of the economics of our global food system. In addition, we also, and I'll talk about these more in depth, neoliberalism, and especially related to free trade, as well as culinary cosmopolitanism. Before I go to the next slide, I do want to talk about what you're seeing here. These are all the logos for the 10 largest fast junk food or ultra processed food companies in the world. Now, most of them are from the United States, but they're actually not all. They're also English and French. Mars, for example, is actually from McLean, Virginia. It's one of our local ones. Coca-Cola, Kellogg, Pepsi, Mondelez, and there's one behind my chat thing. General Mills are all the American ones. And again, these are the things you consume all the time, everything from your sodas to your popcorn and your chips, your candy bars, and things like that. These are all the brands that produce some of that. My spouse, by the way, just got BTS Oreos, which I didn't even know existed until Saturday, and those are from Mondelez. And he ate all of them, which is not good for him, to say the least. All right. So let's get into more of the economics. So while we can talk broadly about late capitalism and particularly some of the corporations involved in junk food production, there's also another important aspect of globalization in food that we have named McDonaldization. Sometimes you'll hear Coquillation, that's the French version of that, but typically it's McDonaldization. This is a term that appears in the late 20th and early 21st century, as you might imagine, because of the success of McDonald's as a global phenomenon in terms of fast food. So how did this come to be? What are some of its strengths and weaknesses, etc.? So McDonald's, like many of the corporations I just talked about, participated in various forms of vertical integration and consolidation. They have an elaborate system of control over food production from the farm to the consumer. In addition, of course, in order to become the global phenomenon that it is, it required governmental interventions in order to access markets, sometimes with mixed success. Notice the background on this slide. This is the Big Arch, which I had in Shannon, Ireland. If you notice it sort of behind some of the words, it actually says it's 100% Irish beef because American beef is banned in Ireland as well as most of Western Europe, not all of it, because of the types of hormones we use in beef. So this is an area where McDonald's has not been successful, but this is a place where there has been advocacy. And then finally, McDonaldization actually has impacted more than just fast food. It has impacted our lives in lots of different ways, particularly, for example, through education. This emphasis on efficiency and uh, affordability, et cetera, often not thinking through that education and learning is a slow, sort of disjointed process, makes it hard, I think, for our young people to learn. And in many ways, it's tied to these ideals. In addition to sort of these bigger things, there are four components that I also want to dig in a little bit more on. First and foremost is this idea of efficiency, that they can produce food incredibly fast within minutes of you pulling up to the window. It's also predictable, meaning that when you get a burger in London or in Fredericksburg, they're going to be somewhat similar. There might be some nuance in terms of that, and they might have some specialty items on the menu, for example, mayonnaise to go with French fries. But most of their sort of stock and trade will be the same. The price or the calculability will be similar. The price points are very similar across the world. And the company is very invested in control. Control, not just in terms of the product and the workers, but also the consumers. They want consumers to come in and out at a rapid pace. In fact, that's why in a McDonald's restaurant, most of us probably hit the drive-through, but if you do go and sit down, you might notice these are not very comfortable seats. That's purposeful. They want people to eat and to go. That's one of the focus of fast food and what makes it so fast. There are also some pros and cons to these businesses that I do want to point out. For example, they have job training programs for high school students, for immigrants and refugees, as well as people of different abilities who otherwise might not have opportunities to work. They also have various social responsibility programs. When we talking about McDonald's, I do want to talk about the Ronald McDonald House, which is an amazing program that helps families who are dealing with some of the hardest things parents have to deal with. In addition, they're often involved in environmental work, which is kind of ironic considering how much they rely on industrialized agriculture, but there is programming tied to that too. And then finally, product consistency. Again, I brought it up before, McDonald's, your burger and fries, it is something that you can get anywhere. And particularly for people who are tourists traveling the world, they often, as Americans, love to go to McDonald's and have a little quote unquote slice of home. There are also, of course, some cons to this. As I mentioned before, industrialized agriculture, which not only adversely impacts the food itself, but also the environment and the workers. With the workers, talking about the actual work environment and how that impacts people. And again, on the agricultural side, the food processing side, as well as in the restaurants themselves. With a lot of this food, there's an emphasis on three things that are often not good for us: salt, sugar, and fat. And so we have to be careful in terms of the nutritional value of some of these foods. And then also that potentially they impact local foodways and traditions. In many ways, is they price sort of local foods out because of their affordability. Now we're going to pivot to some of the political aspects of globalization in food. As I mentioned before, this sort of falls under the broad umbrella of neoliberalism, but particularly the ways in which various governments are negotiating with each other to open up markets to international corporations, such as a McDonald's or a Mondelez or a General Mills, et cetera. This also has a deep history. We can point, for example, to the 17th century when Great Britain and Spain first negotiated a reprieve on tariffs to promote trade between their two countries. But the real game changer was the GATT Treaty of 1947, which 23 nations signed on to as a project to basically rebuild the world economy as a result because of World War II. And with this, a lot of it was about removing protectionist policies and particularly any tariffs. In terms of free trade, tariffs, those are the big things that they're often focused on, reducing those. But also many corporations are interested in intellectual property rights to make sure that those are protected. They want to have access to investment opportunities overseas and even to be able to potentially contract with foreign governments to supply them food, for example. And then also they're interested in potentially being competitive in other sort of markets by often sort of being able to price down lower than what people are used to when it comes to food. There are a lot of problems with free trade. For the food side of this, what we see is particularly inequities in terms of power. Being in the United States and talking about free trade with countries that are not as powerful as our country, you can see it play out in the sort of the nitty-gritty of these treaties, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But also the amount of volatility and disruption to jobs, to local economies that this creates, and potential to lead to over-reliance on foreign trade. We saw this here in the United States, particularly during the pandemic, when international trade was slowed, if not stopped, especially when we talk about tech and cars. They were just not on the move. And we realized that most of the stuff we're not producing here in the United States, they are being produced elsewhere. And that is a huge problem when trade basically stops. So probably, arguably, the most famous free trade agreement is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, what's fascinating about NAFTA is that while it involves Canada, the United States, and Mexico, it was actually rewritten in 2018 and is now known as the USMCA. And just last week, I don't know how timely I could have been, the administration has decided to revisit USMCA to reform it and potentially rewrite some of the stuff on agriculture as well. So this is, again, I was kind of excited how timely this is. What's also fascinating about NAFTA, though, is that agricultural products was so fraught that they actually pulled it out of the agreement. And instead of doing a multilateral free trade agreement, each of the three countries organized treaties amongst themselves. For the United States, one of the biggest things they wanted on the table, pun totally intended here, is corn. The United States is the largest producer of corn in the world. We particularly produce a yellow corn. Often it's a GMO corn that is used for animal feed as well as ethanol production. Mexico, however, is the largest consumer of corn. This is tied to their heritage in terms of indigenous peoples and mestizos peoples who have embraced corn production on the local and regional level, and that it is part of their heritage. By the way, just so you know, these three different varieties of corn you see here on the right, these are some of these heritage corns that I'm talking about. There's a restaurant in Seattle that makes tortillas using these types of heritage corn. They actually have it imported in from Mexico to make them. So that's why these are here. In terms of corn and free trade, very quickly we started to see some major problems. One is, of course, this issue related to heritage and cuisine for Mexican consumers. In corn is really important and really special in Mexico. And in fact, they have 60 what they call land races. These are heritage strains of corn that are unique to very particular regions within Mexico. And with this treaty, the United States not only was trading corn, bringing it into Mexico, but they also started to grow GMO corn in Mexico. That led to cross-pollination and a whole heap of problems because much of this GMO corn is proprietary. So intellectual property becomes an issue. In addition, there were presumptions made that small subsistence-based farmers and farm workers would not be impacted by any of this because most of their agriculture was based upon bartering. We learned very quickly that that was not true. And in fact, the volatility in the market pushed many of these individuals out of their jobs and often pushed them out of agriculture completely into cities and to migrate into the United States. The last thing that's a major component to this, and again, it's sort of an offside thing that happened with all of this, is that Mexico decided to remove some of its price controls on corn and tortillas. And as a result, instead of actually increasing competition and lowering prices, corn companies actually were able to increase prices. And in fact, the cost of tortillas went up over 250% between 1994 and 2004. Tortillas in particular is the food of everyday people in Mexico, especially in rural areas. And this, again, sort of added to the hardship that they were experiencing. Now I want to talk about some of the culinary aspects of globalization and food. Hopefully you enjoyed the reference to the World Cup here. I just couldn't help myself to have some references to either Buc-ee's or free refills or here ranch dressing. I was kind of thought it was great that Kraft, which is a Mondelez product, decided to make TSA approved ranch dressing. In terms of culinary cosmopolitanism, we're talking about three major components. First and foremost is tourism. Tourism until the 19th century was an aristocratic activity. Only the wealthy could travel internationally. I mean, maybe if you're a sailor, but that's really not tourism, that is work. But today we travel at great speeds and at great distances, not just with our food, but ourselves. And that with that travel, we often prioritize food as part of the tourism experience. Many cities now have companies that specialize in culinary tourism. And in fact, I love when I travel overseas to contact some of these companies and to do a food tour in a particular neighborhood, just to sort of see what people like to eat and what restaurants are trying to promote their food and stuff like that. In addition to tourism, immigration is a huge aspect of introducing new foods. And in fact, in a place like the United States, that's sort of like central to how food operates, both in terms of production, but also consumption. Immigrants are central to all of it. In other parts of the world, that's not necessarily the case, but definitely here. For immigrants coming into the United States, particularly today, you can almost cut and paste the food from home to the United States because of that global transportation network. But more often than not, these foods become fusion foods or even something completely new. One of the examples I like to talk with my students about is our bagel with lox and a schmear. A bagel, of course, is from Eastern Europe. Particularly, people point to Poland, brought it to the United States, becomes part of our Jewish American cuisine. But the schmear is not coming from Eastern Europe. And in fact, that was invented in the 18th century by very frugal Quakers, hence why it's called Philadelphia cream cheese. That's not an accident. It's because that's where it originated. But also our lox. Lox, the smoked fish, more often than not, are coming in from Scandinavia or Scotland than from Eastern Europe. It is something that is new. Like in Eastern Europe, you would have never eaten something like this. It is quintessentially American, as well as Jewish American. It can be both. And again, it's something that we see here in the United States all the time. The last thing in terms of cosmopolitanism is the circulation of information. And that's particularly central to the emergence of our various forms of digital media. Whether we're talking about celebrity cooking shows or celebrity travel shows, things like Bourdain, etc., or all the stuff that's going on your Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. I don't know how many times I've watched people eat on social media, and we all do it. We all love it. And in fact, we love to take photos of our food and post it on our social media as well. This helps us circulate ideas about food, which again, a lot of us really enjoy. Now I'd like to pivot to the last two sections of my talk today. I'm going to talk about some of the reactions to food and globalization, and then we'll move to some of the things about where to move from here. So there have been a lot of reactions to globalization in food because of its disruptive nature, especially in rural communities. One of the major movements in response to food and globalization is the food sovereignty movement. This started in the late 20th century and has expanded and grown to today. It's an international phenomenon. The food sovereignty movement particularly focuses on rural people, people from the margins who need or who do not have control over their own food systems and are looking to have that type of control and autonomy back. Also, to have access to culturally appropriate and healthy foods. Again, sort of talking about some of the nutrition things, but also thinking about what are local cuisines, what are regional cuisines, various types of agrarian reforms to empower our farmers, to empower our farm workers so that they have a safe work environment and that they're proud of the work that they are doing. And then finally, thinking through the environmental impacts. Agriculture, by its very nature, impacts the environment, but we can mitigate that by being more conscious of what we are doing in terms of things like pesticides and fertilizers, etc. There are two sort of classic examples of the food sovereignty movement that I wanted to point to. First is the slow food movement, which was started in 1986. One of the leaders, by the way, is Carlos Petrini, who just passed away. It literally started because McDonald's opened uh, in Rome next to the Spanish Steps. Many Italians were absolutely outraged by this. They were so worried about the impact of not just McDonald's, but American fast food on their culinary traditions that they decided to create this movement. Every year, if not every 2 years, there's actually an international meeting to discuss the slow food movement. For them, they're of course focused on people producing the food, but also how we consume food. One of the major components of the slow food movement is the social aspect of eating, that we don't eat alone or in our car, all of which I have done. I ate by myself, even my lunch today. Um, that there is something very human about eating with other people. We also have La Via Campesina. This is a indigenous and peasant-based movement that started in places like Mexico and Central America because of the disruption caused by policies such as NAFTA. Um, this group in particular is involved in various forms of advocacy, trying to protect rights in rural areas, and have worked with the United Nations in creating a declaration of the rights of rural peoples. I think that was written in 2017 or 2018. Moving sort of across the political spectrum. And again, one of the things that's important to understand is that these reactions to globalization, it's sort of across the political spectrum that we're seeing this type of activism emerge. Sort of moving sort of more to the center, scholars talk about the phenomenon of what we call gastro-nationalism. This is tied to many of the ideas inherited from French cuisine, and particularly the idea of terroir, or taste of place. Terroir emerges as this idea that food isn't just something you eat, it is tied to the rocks and the soil and the sunshine and the moisture and the people who make it. That's why champagne is only from the Champagne region of France, right? That certain cheeses only come from particular places, because it's all these things that have to come together to make that thing. As a result, we see, particularly in Europe, a variety of legislative interventions to protect food based upon the concept of terroir. France has led the charge on much of this, particularly for the creation of AOC, not from New York, right? Today, it's actually known as AOP, but it's this idea of protecting artisanal or heritage cuisine, particularly when it comes to France, things like wine and cheese. In 1992, with the European Union, this concept that was already established in France and other parts of Western Europe was expanded to the entire EU. And now there is actually labeling on foods throughout the EU related to this. And then in 2001, UNESCO created a new category of heritage known as intangible cultural heritage. Now, this category was created not necessarily because of terroir, but because of other types of criticisms that UNESCO was experiencing, particularly when it created its heritage program back in the 70s. Many of the places being proposed to be put on the list were places that hadn't been ravaged by war or colonization and had these massive structures and edifices that could be celebrated as part of people's heritage. The idea of intangible heritage, it's not just about food. We're talking about music, folk tales, religion, dance, and then of course food. And by the way, I believe the first food item to end up on that list was the quote unquote French meal. I don't quite know precisely what that is, but it is on the list, and it's one of the earliest ones. Finally, we also see scholars studying what's known as gastronativism, also called gastrofascism. This is not new, but it's new to us, perhaps. We see gastrofascism emerge, particularly in places like Germany and Italy in the early part of the 20th century. In terms of the literature on Italy, they point to the colonization of East Africa as a quote unquote breadbasket that was supposed to feed the Italian nation. Today, it plays out a little differently, and I'll explain some of the specifics in a second. So for gastronativism, there's this focus on rural identity, but not necessarily people who are indigenous or often working class workers. There's also this emphasis on traditional patriarchal family values and then self-sufficiency. Now, self-sufficiency here, however, is not necessarily the self-sufficiency of the farmer, him or herself, but in fact, the self-sufficiency of the nation and how farmers are integral to that potential project. And then finally, gastronativism, it's known for its anti-immigrant sentiments and promotion of anti-immigrant legislation. They see the introduction of food from other parts of the world, not just McDonald's, but all of it, such as this is actually Korean barbecue from Rome, as a threat to the body politic. And that by stopping immigration, you'll stop the exchange of culinary traditions. One of the sort of examples that a lot of scholars focus on is La Lega Nord or La Lega Party in Italy. This is the fascist party. They are very much support of many of the things that I was just talking about. One of the things, though, that I find as a historian as well as somebody who studies food interesting is that the way in which they package food identity in Italy is very different than how it was under, say, Mussolini. Today, there's sort of this line about if you're Italian, you eat polenta, not couscous. Well, polenta is actually a New World food. It's made of corn, so it is indigenous to the Americas. But couscous is made of wheat and actually has a lot more in common with pasta than polenta ever did. And pasta, by the way, was one of the things that Mussolini actually promoted as quintessential to Italian identity back in the 1920s and 1930s. So again, even the way in which gastrofascism uses food changes over time as well. The last thing that I want to talk about, and this is particularly for the students on this Zoom call, is what you can do with some of the things that I'm talking about. So first and foremost, educate yourself. Learn about where your food is coming from, who makes it, are there regulations that guide its production, and what goes into it. Being more educated about our food often helps us to make better food choices. But there's some other things that I highly recommend that we do. One is listen to our community elders. Many of our elders have seen a lot of stuff go down when it comes to food. Even for myself, I hadn't had an avocado or a mango until I was in college in Los Angeles. And so where those things actually grow there, they didn't exist. I grew up in rural New Hampshire. We just never had them. But now I can have them year round. That's in many ways for me kind of weird. It is not natural and it is not normal, but it's our elders who have that information, that knowledge. If you can, if you have the time or the inclination, try to grow your own food and try to learn how to cook. Because when you learn how to produce food, you often become empowered by that process. And then finally, it's important to understand nutrition and that there are some things, they might be really good, they might be really delicious, but they're probably not good for you, such as the BTS Oreos that my spouse ate all weekend long. And with that, I'm going to end it and I guess turn it over to Professor Rauder. These are photos, by the way, of Cuba where I've done research as well. So these are from the agroecotourism site that I worked in. It was, again, absolutely amazing.
Great, thank you very much. That was quite informative. So the floor is open to questions. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box.
Okay, should I stop sharing, Professor
Oh,
Rauter?
you can keep that up. Those are
Okay.
nice pictures.
Okay.
So yeah, one thing that I wanted to bring up since you talked about McDonald's, and that will be also up in the discussion section afterwards,
Hmm.
is the Big Mac index, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I put it here in the chat if you want to see that. So the Big Mac index is an index of the prices of a Big Mac across the world, and McDonald's is that big that they are basically in almost every country in the world. I think with the exception of North Korea and Iceland, where they actually faltered because they couldn't get the ingredients at a reasonable price. But this Big Mac index shows how much a Big Mac is, and it says something about the buying power of the different countries and also about exchange rates. So it's often used in businesses and business education to have a quick look at countries and their buying power. Okay, so let's see. No questions so far. Don't be shy.
I know it was a lot
Yeah, it was
in,
what's
in
going
like
on.
48 minutes.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting that that movement about getting on the list of the UNESCO list of
mhm.
non-tangible items is quite prominent right now.
Yeah.
I remember I'm for those who haven't figured out the accent yet. I'm from Germany originally and from Thuringia, which is famous for its bratwurst. And they applied actually for getting on that list, and so did Franconia, which is the next region over. And their bratwurst actually made it onto the list, and ours did not. So
Yeah. Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's actually really popular, these lists for tourism. They have
Yeah.
promoted a lot of culinary tourism through the creation of these lists, for good and bad, right? It helps
Hmm.
a lot of these artisanal farmers um, make money, potentially even sell stuff overseas if the regulations allow for it. Um,
Hmm.
but there's also these other types of issues about whose heritage is it?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, what makes a local food local? Is it
yeah,
like the ingredients? Is it the origin? Is it a ritual? Is it the price? No? Okay.
right, right. Is it about process or the product?
Right. All right.
I think there's a similar fight or there was, in certain parts of Mexico related to tortillas, which
Hmm.
I think there are some tortillas on that intangible list. And again, but it's also something that is eaten throughout Mexico, right?
Hmm.
But they use these land races of corn, right? These heritage strains. And so in theory, you could put all of them on that intangible list.
Hmm.
But they're all sort of have different origin stories.
I actually knew a little bit about the French meal that you mentioned because
Yes,
I
thank
spoke
you.
about it in a Sister City talk a couple weeks back, but it ties together a lot of things you talked about actually, right? So it's neither French cuisine as a whole nor a specific dish, but
Yeah,
the social practice of a
yeah,
French meal. So bringing people, you were talking about eating alone, right? Or
yeah,
and so it's the opposite, bringing friends and family together. Conversation is mentioned in the sort of declaration as well. And then carefully selecting ingredients, preferably local. And the final aspect was the presentation, both the order of the meal and then the
yeah.
table itself. So it was sort of a complex. Think I read the formal proclamation when I was preparing for that talk, but
Do you
it
remember
was,
is it a staggered presentation or is it all
yes,
at one time? Okay.
staggered.
Yeah. So
'Cause
there's different serving styles. There's like a Russian serving style where you put everything on the table all at once. And then the French serving style is supposed to be in courses, right?
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
Louis XIV started that
Yeah.
division, right, from the medieval. Yeah. So I think it was the the aperitif, so the drink, right? The before dinner drink, then the appetizer,
Yeah.
then fish or meat with veggies, then cheese, then dessert, and then the optional digestif, the after dinner drink. And it's always that six, right? Those six things in order.
Yeah. Yeah. In Cuba, in the photos that you see here, it was the Russian course style where everything's just put on the table and
Mhm.
Yeah.
you eat.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, it's sort of the influence of the Soviets. Because
yeah.
I don't know if it was all, I know from looking at Cuban menus, they definitely did a French course practice, at least amongst elite households. But where I was, I mean, I'm actually outside. We were eating outside. We always ate outside, actually, in Cuba.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, that it was always everything all at once, except for coffee and dessert.
Mhm.
Mhm.
We have our first question. Yeah.
Great.
So, Rob Erickson asked, I have heard the term cultural appropriation in terms of developing foods to sell. Is
Mhm.
that a significant impediment to food traveling the world?
Yeah, cultural appropriation, absolutely. And this is one of the things that you have to navigate within culinary cosmopolitanism is when do people take food from a particular region and then monetize it either in that place or maybe elsewhere. So cultural appropriation doesn't in doesn't have to be a global phenomenon, right? It can be somebody going into, say, an immigrant community who is not part of that community, learning about a food tradition, and then figuring out a way to maybe monetize it. For a broader audience. So that's often where we see it, and where the impact is that they're taking somebody else's heritage, often detaching it from that heritage, that tradition, but also they're making money off of that as well, and sort of erasing that connection to people and community where that dish occurs. We see that actually a lot with Mexican cuisine, tacos and burritos in particular. I mean, we don't even often think about it. Things like Taco Bell and Chipotle, right? Those are examples of cultural appropriation that we go into drive by every day. Um, so it's something it's almost normalized, but it maybe it shouldn't be, right? Maybe we need to be a little bit more self-reflective of that as well.
Mm.
So great question.
Yeah, I brought up in an earlier talk the example of Diane Kennedy and her cookbook.
Mhm.
She, a British woman living in Mexico, who
Yeah,
interviewed all the cooks of her friends, and then basically sorted those recipes and
yeah,
made quite a lot of money with it. You know, with that cookbook. I doubt that she really gave any of that money to those
yeah,
cooks that she got the recipes from. No,
yeah,
so
yeah. There's another a cook whose cookbooks I have. Her name is Fuchsia Dunlop. She's also British. And she was an anthropology student, I think from Oxford or Cambridge, who had was studying in central China. And she ended up signing up for one of the local culinary schools. And this is back in the 80s and the early 90s when women didn't go to culinary school in China. And never mind an outsider. And so she became sort of this intermediary. Her position is sort of it's complicated, and so in many ways, even in China, her cookbooks are celebrated because she actually started writing things down in ways that they wouldn't be. But she's also participating in a level of cultural appropriation, but she tries to also address it too. So this is, there's sort of the insider outsider stuff. There's ways to negotiate it for better or for worse. So are there other questions?
when I teach my class on business German, we are often talk about advertisement, and I have a series of McDonald's advertisement that we talk about because McDonald's in Germany is slightly different than McDonald's is here. I mean, it's almost true for for
Yeah,
every country. But I think in the United States, McDonald's has in the meantime often a little bit of the reputation that it is something where poor people eat, or
Yeah.
people that have to be quite aware of their money. In Germany, there is a completely different approach. They try to advertise with the freshness of the ingredients. So there was in the like early 2000s, they took people to the farm where the potatoes grow for the French fries, or to the farm where the cows are that become the
Yeah.
patty for the and it was all like young professionals, no? Kind of
Yeah.
they tried to appeal to the also they introduced in Europe the Mac Cafe, I think I saw the very first one in the United States where they tried to create some sort of coffee shop with
Yeah.
more comfortable seating, so a little bit modeled after the Starbucks.
Right. Right. Which again, we don't
Mhm.
have here. It's the very uncomfortable hard
Mhm,
seats.
mhm, mhm.
So does Germany ban American beef? It sounds like they must.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. If it's
Yeah.
a European thing, yeah, Germany's probably on it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's something that you see particularly in Europe because of the hormone use. Um,
Mhm,
they have different fast food restaurants deal with local foods differently. I know
mhm,
from talking to people in places like for the Caribbean, for example, Kentucky Fried Chicken and other fried chicken have done a much better job working with local farmers than McDonald's did. And so oftentimes KFC like becomes almost like central to the local economy. And in fact, like on Christmas Day, you go in Jamaica, you go to KFC, right? Like it
mhm,
becomes this special thing, but also they see it as an investment in their community. McDonald's, particularly when they tried to get into like Jamaica, that didn't quite play out that way. They wanted to import chicken from the United States.
mhm.
Um, so that's again something, every place is a little different. And that's why some of this can get really, really complicated. But yeah, fried chicken. I mean, also if folks have been to Bonchon, like speaking of fried chicken, that is in response to American fried chicken going to South Korea, particularly around American military bases, and Koreans going, oh yeah, we'll take it up a notch. And not only that, we're going to re-import it back to the United States, right? And so there's this give and take within globalization too. And the banchan, the fried chicken, I don't know if folks have had the sweet or the spicy. I mean, the spicy is spicy. So it's pretty amazing stuff.
There's another question from Child
Sure.
Omar. Is Julia Child considered to have appropriated French food, or did
Oh,
Time Life
interesting.
series Food of the World considered appropriation?
I have never heard her associated with that, but part of it is because of her training in French cuisine.
Mhm.
Besides wasn't she CIA too?
Oh,
Yeah.
her husband, her husband, yeah, was, yeah.
So yeah, but I haven't heard of that. At least in terms of the her TV programs in the 1960s, she was sort of the intermediary of French cuisine to American consumers, um, much more so. But it would be interesting question to ask, actually, maybe French culinary experts that question.
Mhm.
It'd be cool to ask.
I think it goes more maybe in the education direction.
Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, she made money from it as well. I don't know how much, or if it was extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a great question too.
I'm pretty sure at the beginning, I mean, I don't know whether this necessarily changes the outcome, but at the beginning, she collaborated with two French chefs. And
Mhm.
then, like you were saying, it was more about popularization of French cuisine in the
Yeah,
US, right?
through her
So,
television show. Yeah,
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 Because it was considered very complicated to make.
right.
So
well, and to film it, like if you watch some of the early episodes, it's like one take. And so
yeah.
The amount of work that is going on behind the scenes in the cabinets to make that look that seamless and that perfect for like her beef bourguignon, for example. That's the one I show in my classes. Like it is not this easy, it
Mhm.
is, and of course you don't get to taste it anyways. So, but yeah, it's kind of interesting her role in terms of television and circulating information about food. There are precursors. There are other people before her. James Beard, for example, like the James Beard Award, he is a decade or two before her doing some of this stuff. But for most Americans, it's Julia Child.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I did want to bring up too is some of the nutrition stuff. Been a huge debate if folks are interested in maybe more of the biology of some of this, the debate about ultra processed foods and junk food and sort of these two different camps within sort of nutrition. So one of the debates is for ultra processed food is that you're focusing on food process and that industrialized food system is potentially bad, but junk food is focusing on the end result, like the food quality and the nutrition in whatever that is. And they're trying to sort of figure out what does that all mean in terms of our health if you focus on process versus focus on final product. And they don't actually have any answers. But one of the things some of the scholars point out is grandma can make homemade white bread, or you can go to the store and buy multigrain bread. Guess which one is probably better for you, right? And so even if it's homemade, it might not be nutritious in terms of what's going into it, but maybe that store-bought bread, it will have some preservatives in it so that it's shelf stable, but in fact might have more nutritional value. And so in terms of the whole literature on nutrition, this has been going on, particularly in the Lancet, which is the British Medical Association
Mhm.
journal, is sort of trying to figure out and how to move forward on process versus product in terms of promoting health and nutrition. And they have like some really strong lines drawn on some of this stuff, which is absolutely fascinating. So it's
Mhm.
something for folks to sort of think about too, that none of this stuff has been answered. It's
Mhm.
still being debated among scholars, which is kind of cool.
What do you think about the current kind of craze for protein? It seems to be
So
everyone is kind of now pushing protein.
yeah, pushing protein. What I think I'm glad you brought it up because one of the things that the scholarship discussing things like gastronativism has been talking about the new food pyramid that came out from the USDA earlier this year, and whether or not that's an example of potentially gastronativism or even gastrofascism. And scholars are sort of across the board on this, but particularly it's the way it was rewritten to emphasize meat consumption in ways that no previous American nutrition pyramid ever did,
Mhm.
was a red flag for a lot of people. So that was sort of interesting because in many ways it harkens back to earlier forms of fascism that associates meat consumption with strong military, right? And sort of strong men. And in fact, even in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States, there was this anti-Chinese sort of slogan about meat versus rice. This was a way to condemn Chinese immigrants that was promoted by white labor organizations as well. So this stuff, this emphasis on meat has some interesting sort of political implications, not just some of the nutritional ones, because most folks who work in nutrition point out not all meat is the same, right? In terms of its qualities, a lot of it has a lot of fat that we have to be careful about, right? Um, so that's something to think about. There's also preservatives that potentially go into meat. And if you're an American eating meat, you might need to think about some of the stuff that goes into that production, right? I've talked about hormones, but also the types of diets these animals are eating potentially impact the quality of that meat as well. So it's kind of been an interesting discussion, very American. because in the United States, we don't have this idea of a French meal, right? That just doesn't work because of our size as a nation, like physical size, but also our diversity. In the 1930s, actually, the WPA tried to create a program on American food, and it blew up in their face because they realized that it was impossible to figure out what is American food the way that French could figure it out or the way the Italians could figure it out. The regional variation and immigration are central to the variety of cuisines that we see throughout the United States. So a lot of scholars who work in the American field are pointing to some of this stuff with the USDA. What's also interesting about the USDA is, of course, that informs our food policy for schools and SNAP and other types of programs. Increasing this to this level of protein is unaffordable. So I don't know how they're going to afford to shift our school lunch programs and SNAP to ensure that level of protein consumption. So all sorts of interesting conversations to think about with nutrition.
Okay.
And I actually hadn't heard the term gastrofascism before, but when you mentioned school lunch, it sort of occurred to me when
Yeah.
you were talking about it. Does that include things like um, Philadelphia's tax on soda and things like
Yeah.
that, and banning the vending machines?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Potentially. A lot of discussion interesting on gastronativism and gastrofascism are coming from Italian scholars who are watching sort of what's going on with La Lega in Italy. They're often actually they're writing in Italy, but they're also writing in the United States.
Okay.
So yeah, they're sort of leading sort of this conversation because they're seeing it at home. And it's just so prominent there. So
Yeah.
yeah, on Professor Rauter, were you able to circulate the bibliography that I
Yes,
had
I
here?
sent it out earlier
Oh,
today. Yeah.
fabulous. Yeah, because some of the literature on that is on that list. So people can check
Right.
it out. There's actually a great book on Polish cuisine and grappling with sort of gastro-nationalism and sort of trying to figure out what is Polish cuisine in a post-Soviet world and sort of thinking through like the regional variations and also the Jewish question. Like, how do you rectify particularly the lack of, Jewish cooking going on in Poland when actually so many Jews were part of food production prior to World War II. So some really interesting conversations going on there. I think it's called the pierogi problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so awesome title. So I know Professor Rauter, you're interested in stuff on food in Poland. I think that book does a great job
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
of addressing that.
Okay. Thank you very much. It doesn't seem that we have more questions. Thank you for an enlightened presentation, and we will see each other again on Thursday when Danilo Orofino will talk to us about immigration stories, his way to Fredericksburg, and we have some questions for him about his restaurant too, and I'm looking forward to have somebody who is a practitioner
Yeah, that's
daily
awesome.
to talk about food. Okay, have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye bye,
Bye, everybody.
and the students
Bye.
I see with the Overling in like 5 minutes. Okay, okay, bye bye,
Kristen.
Bye.
bye.